All right, in the last video we talked about loans, and you're all experts on loans now. So let's move on to the next type of financial asset, bonds. So bonds are IOUs, and that's not inaccurate. Well, I guess sort of is. It's an IOU. It's a yo money, right? That's all a bond really is. They're scored by a bond rating agency. You don't need to know much about that, but basically just kind of like a credit report, but for bonds and for different institutions and even the U.S. government and countries. Different things can have bonds. So rather than individual score reports, like you have a score, credit score, and I have a credit score, and everybody has one, companies get these, basically ratings for their bonds. Higher risk, pay higher interest. Higher risk, higher reward. So if there's a startup company and they want to get money, one option they have is to sell bonds, right? They can basically have people loan them money in the form of bonds. That's kind of what they basically are. Um, so they get an IOU from people, and people can give them money. And if that company is risky, maybe it's not a great idea or it's something groundbreaking, and you're not sure it's going to work out, that company is not going to be able to sell bonds at a low interest rate. They're going to get rated as a very high risk organization. They might go under. So people, if they're going to invest their money and give money to this company, buy bonds from this company, they're only going to do that if they can have a high chance of reward, right? They're very risk tolerant people. They live by the seat of their pants, and they're going to give a bond to some, or buy basically give a loan, buy a bond from a company. They're only going to do it if they can get a large amount of money in return. So if you're somebody, I don't know, IBM or something, some company that's considered to be fairly stable, they're going to be able to sell bonds at a really low interest rate because they're not going to collapse. They're very low risk, and they're more stable. So typically bonds, the interest rate's fairly low. Bonds, you're probably going to be beating inflation for the most part. You're not going to be becoming a millionaire, billionaire. The bonds are not what you buy to become an overnight success. Like if you bought Apple in the late '90s and held on to it till today, that's stocks, and we'll talk about that later. Bonds are kind of just more of a safety net. More of a they're a stable thing to invest in, especially for like retirement savings and such. Anyway, so bonds are basically sold by an institution or government. Can be we'll talk about that sort of stuff later on, later chapters talking about the country going into debt and stuff. And everybody gets the same rate. The bond rating agency looks at a company and says, hey, if you want to sell bonds, that's cool. This is the interest rate that you're going to sell in that. So everybody who gets, I don't know, 10%, that's ridiculous, but whatever, 10% interest rate for a bond, everybody gets that interest rate. And so if you want to, if I'm Microsoft and I want to sell bonds to people because I want to start building up money, I want to, invest in something new or whatever, I want to increase my company, so I start selling bonds to get this money. Anybody who wants to buy a bond from me gets the exact same interest rate. And this cuts down on transaction costs. Because we said with loans, when you go to get a loan, you have to go and get your credit check scored and all this stuff. There's a lot of transactions, time and stuff is involved. And every loan is different. Every loan is different. You might have similar rates, you might have similar conditions and stuff like that, but everyone's a little, excuse me, I got hiccups. Everyone's a little bit different. So bonds, though, everybody's the same, no transaction costs. Everybody, is on the same page for the most part. Anyways, pretty easy to resell because it's standardized and because everything is pretty much the same. It's a piece of paper. It says this amount of money, $1,000 at 10%, whatever. You know what you're getting, and everybody, is above board on this. Um, let's see. Everybody knows what they're getting. Da, 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 da. Oh yeah, here's one of probably the most important things with a bond. A bond is a promise. By law, if a company fails, it must repay its bondholders before anyone else, including stockholders. So you might own stock in a company. God forbid, let's say Microsoft. You own Microsoft stock, and let's say Microsoft goes under. Right, it tanks. Well, they might still have valued assets. They might still have. I'm sure they own some kind of factories, and they might have warehouses and computers and all sorts of office buildings and stuff. Those all have value, and those things will get sold off during bankruptcy. And some of the stockholders might see some return on that. But they only get money if there's anything left after the bondholders are paid off. Bonds are IOUs backed by law. That is a loan, essentially, a debt that the company has to pay back. They have to pay that back before anybody gets anything else. Think about maybe in your own personal lives if somebody has a massive amount of debt, right? They may have a massive amount of debt, and let's say they own a house and they own a boat and they own all this stuff, and they want to pass that on to their heirs, to their children or grandchildren. Their children and grandchildren might not get any of those things because those things will have to go to be paid off that person's debt when they pass away. That's similar situation, instead of bankruptcy, death. But anyway, so bonds, IOUs, typically not going to make you a fortune, but they are considered to be a stable way of beating inflation. Let's look at how bonds work, and let's look at some of the confusing words that you might hear for bonds. So let's look at this here. Par value of $1,000 with 10% interest, with 10% annual coupon, paid semi-annually and maturing in 2 years. Okay, that's standard bond speak, and you're like, what the heck is this talking about? It's really not that bad. They just use some funny words. So institution, who it is, they're selling a bond worth what they call par, which is the nominal face value, what it says on there. It's not a just inferred inflation or anything like that. It's just you go into the institution, whoever, you're probably doing this all online nowadays, but you go to buy a bond and it says $1,000, right? So it says $1,000, that's the nominal face value, and it's going to give you 10% annually. Okay, so 10% annually. So you know that you're making 10% every year. On top of that, so $1,000 bond that you bought, you gave a company $1,000, you loaned them $1,000 essentially, and every year they are going to pay you 10%. All right, that's all this says. So $100, $100, right? And so every year, and they're going to do that for 2 years. All right, so for 2 years. So in 2 years, you're going to get your $1,000 back. That's a loan, so you're going to get that money back with 10% annually. So 2 years, so you're going to get that money back on annually. So next year, you're going to go back and get your $1,000 plus $200. This middle part here is where it can maybe get a little confusing. Coupon paid semi-annually. Okay, that's a little weird, but why coupon and stuff? A coupon. Think about this: if you've ever gone to a store, like sometimes in schools, college campuses have these a lot. There'll be a tear-off sheet, like is anybody interested in buying puppies? Tear off this number and call or whatever. It'll be a piece of paper that people have cut the very bottom of so you could tear off a little piece of paper. Well, that's how bonds used to work back way before computers and back in the olden days, 100 plus years ago. You would buy a bond and it would be a physical piece of paper. And at the very top would be little tabs you could pull off on the top, little coupon tabs. And then you would go and turn that coupon tab in and they would give you your payment sometimes. So bonds were sometimes paid and still are paid sometimes in set amounts. So every 6 months you would be able to go in, because this is semi-annually, so every 6 months you would go in and tear off your little piece of paper, your coupon, and hand it to them, and they would give you $50 for your investment. So every 6 months you would be able to do that. That's why they say a coupon. That's just a holdover from ancient history, and paid semi-annually. So we're saying just that it's going to be paid every 6 months, and maturing, which just means it's ending, it's becoming an adult, I guess. It's ending its life in 2 years. So $1,000 loan, 10% annually, paid semi-annually, coupon paid semi-annually, and finally maturing in 2 years. After 2 years, you get your $1,000 plus $200 back, and that bond is done, right? That bond is finished, essentially. It's all kaput. But hopefully 10% is I'm just using round numbers. 10% is probably pretty high for a bond, but you're basically getting more money than inflation, so you're worked out. And the company, meanwhile, got that money, and hopefully they made money off of that $1,000. They invested it, they built factories, they bought patents or came up with something, hired people, increased their output, increased their sales, and beat that $200. So over 2 years, hopefully they made $400, right? Or $1,000 plus that extra money. So anyway, so you loan the company that money, they agreed to pay you back, they pay you back, yay, interest is called, yeah, we covered all this. Next one. All right, so bonds in the future. Let's say you bought your bond for $1,000. All right, that's the exact same example we just did. You bought your bond for $1,000 with 10% interest. All right, and that was based off the risk assessment. The bond agencies looked at it at the moment. They said, okay, this company right now, they can sell bonds. They can sell $1,000 bonds, 10% interest. That's the current risk assessment. Another month passes. So let's say you buy it in March. Now it's April. You've got a problem. I don't know, your car breaks down, your fridge breaks down, something, you need money and you need money fast. And you weren't very clever, you didn't plan ahead, you don't have any reserve currency. So, you're not very liquid right now and you need liquidity. Well, bonds can be made liquid. They're just not. It's not as easy. You can't go to Taco Bell and buy a chalupa with a bond. That's not going to happen. So you need to sell that bond. Here's the question, though. Well, I guess I'll give the rest of the scenario. The downside is the company is now rated at 15%. But your piece of paper, your bond, says that you have a bond of $1,000 with 10% interest. But if I were to go and get a bond today for that exact same company, I would give them $1,000 and they would give me a return of 15% interest. I would get a higher interest rate. Are you able to sell your bond for $1,000? Why or why not? And think about that for a second. Pause the video and think. I don't believe. Pause it. Think about it. Okay. So hopefully you've thought about this a little bit. You have a loan, originally $1,000, 10%. You need cash, right? Can you sell it for $1,000 if the interest rate is now 15%? Well, the answer is you are able to sell your bond, but not for $1,000. All right, not for $1,000 because your bond is not worth that anymore, and your bond is not worth as much as a bond that is currently being sold, assuming people want to buy these bonds, right? So if I bought a bond from a company today, I would lock in 15%. Why do I want a crappy 10%? Right? So you need cash right now, and you really want that $1,000 that you just spent last month, but you're not going to get that now. Somebody might buy that $1,000 bond from you, but they're only going to buy it at a discount rate. All right, and this is what they call the bond discount rate. So I'll buy that bond from you, but you're going to have to give me a discount. I'm not going to give you $1,000. I might give you like $800. I'm just pulling numbers out of my head right here, but there's actually a fancy math calculation that you can use for this stuff if you really want to play around with it. You won't need it for your AP exam. You need to know the concept. You don't need to know necessarily this equation. But I might buy it, but I'll buy it at a discounted rate. I will give you maybe $800. All right, and you're like, God, I just spent $1,000 on this, and I was hoping to get 10% interest on it, and now I can only sell $800. That's not fair. Well, okay, think about that though. If I were to go and buy my own bond of $1,000, I would get 15% interest. For me to buy a bond with 10% interest would not be fair to me, and so I'm not going to, give you, apples to apples. I'm not going to give you the direct paper value of that, right? I'll give you a discount, and there is a way of figuring out what that discount properly should be. So, anyways, of course, the inverse is also true. If rates drop, let's say the company goes from 10% and not to 15%, let's say it goes down to 5%, then your bond might be worth more money, right? People might be more willing to spend more than $1,000 to buy your bond from you, because your piece of paper is now worth more than what I could go get on the open market currently. This is from the course exam description, the CED. This is what they need you to know about this. They don't want you necessarily to know the math. Nowhere have I seen any practice questions for this. I checked with other AP exam teachers because you would probably need a calculator to figure this out accurately. All you need to know is that the price of previously issued bonds and interest rates on bonds are inversely related. When interest rates go up, the price of your previously issued bond, so what you paid for, that $1,000, will go down. All right, so interest rates up, price down. And then the opposite is also true. When interest rates go down, price goes up. Yay! So once again, you need to know the discount rate. You need to understand this concept right here, the inverse relationship. But you don't necessarily need to know this equation. All right, just be aware of the concepts. All right, and I think that's it for bonds. Next, we're going to get into stonks, and we'll do that in the next video.